Hi folks, it's Mike, and today we're going to have a look at doing some Photoshop. Mainly we're going to have a look at doing something we call pixel maps. So it's a very straightforward way of mapping and just getting something down on the page. They're not massively high fidelity when you start, but you can advance them quite a lot. So it's a really good place to start, especially if you've got no Photoshop experience at all. And it's just a really quick mapping technique as well. So I'm just going to open Photoshop up. I'll start with a new 500 by 500 pixels. It doesn't really matter about anything else there. So let's just create that. And we have our blank canvas, which is great. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to draw out this map from pretty much every board game of Space Hulk. It's one of the first or second maps you ever play. It's really straightforward. Your maps are obviously a bit more complicated and a lot longer, but we'll get the basics down with this, and if you can follow along with this, you'll be able to do it on a much bigger scale. This is just getting the basics down for it. So what I want to start off with is, let's get rid of this white background because it's very bright. So I've just picked a nice green shade here, so all you have to do is click there. Two screens, something like that, just so we've got a background which isn't bright white. Next thing we're going to do is we are going to zoom pretty close in. Now, 16, yeah, I'll probably do. If you don't have this grid, you either need to change your background from white, or you need to press Ctrl and H, and that will actually put on your pixel map grid. Automatic for the most part, and it's a really good thing because we can actually use these pixels as scale indicators. So a lot of the time you want 1 pixel to the player scale, but you can change maps. I'll show you some different ones after we've kind of finished this one. So next thing we need to do is we actually need to start drawing something out. So we are going to add ourselves a new layer. Never do everything on the same layer, because if you want to come and change stuff, it starts getting very complicated the further down the line you go. So just hit that button down there, and that will give us a new layer. Always name your layers. I'll call it map for now. So I am going to go and access my pencil. So rather than the brush, which will give you something like that, which is not good for us, we are going to instead use the pencil tool. So if you use an old version of Photoshop, it's B and you just hold down over the brush and it'll give you the pencil tool. The new version is actually a separate button for this, which is great. So what we want to do is, first off, pick a colour. I've gone for kind of this darkish grey. We don't want a black colour and we don't want a white colour, something like that, so we can manipulate it a bit later on using the kind of solid black and solid white. It's more tricky to change things later on, so we'll do something like this. Right, make sure your opacity is set to 100, smoothing 0, auto erase off, all that stuff. So you might not have some of these options, but opacity 100% is imperative. And then make sure your size is also set to 1. And if you've got hardness, set it to 100 as well. The last thing you want to do when you're doing pixel stuff is get weird transparency issues. It just looks horrible. And it's not obvious what you want to be doing. Okay, so with that set up, you should be able to literally just draw stuff like that straight away, and you can see it's confined to the pixel grid, which is great, especially when we're coming to do very basic mapping like we're doing today. So I'm going to recreate that map that I've just shown you, that one there, in pixels as we go along. So it's quite straightforward as long as you've kind of got a reference to what you're doing, which I do. I'll just keep going like this for a while. Yeah. Fast forward until I'm done if you want. Okay. Stuff like this is a very, as I said, very straightforward map, and this is actually based on a board game, so it's a lot easier. But once you kind of get the idea that you're just creating the spaces that the player can go to, especially for like a UT map or anything like that, based on the fact that the player is one square, It starts getting a lot easy, obviously, when you've got massive maps. So some of the games, some of the levels that you are possibly looking at have massive sprawling maps. Either pick a smaller map, there's an easy one, or you'll just have to use some different techniques to actually figure out how to do it. But I'll show you how to upscale these maps after I've done this. So almost done, honest. Wrong stickler for perfection. There we go. A very basic map, but you can see I've done that in under a few minutes. Time, if we just go back to the reference, yep, that's pretty much it. We're not after crystal precision when you're doing this, because it's quite difficult to do it, especially with a pixel map. But this is the kind of level of things that we would get started with. So once we've got the map, we need to add some more details onto it, because at the minute there's not really much going on. So in Space Hulk and whatever, we do have doors, are a major key mechanic of every level. We usually have objectives, we have a spawn start area, and then we will have enemy placements as well. So what we do is add ourselves some new layers and just call them that. So we'll start with doors. So when we've got layers, we can draw some different stuff. So let's do a nice luminous green, I suppose, for the doors. So with the idea of a layer, we could draw some stuff on, and then we can hide that. So when we're showing different maps for different reasons, we can actually just hide stuff in our layers, which is great. So for this, I'm going to put the doors down where I know they are. So there's one there, one there, one there, one there, one there, one round on the corridor, one there as well, and I believe that's it. So again, very straightforward when we're doing this, but if I want to know where the doors are on the map, there they are. So next up, player starts. Do name all of this stuff. I know it's an extra annoying step, but when you come back and you got 200 layers that are all just called, layer 1, layer 2, it will get absolutely annoying for you when you're doing this. So start locations for us, we actually have 5. For your maps, you might only have 1, or you might have team spawns, things like that. Depends which games you do, I suppose, and which assignment you're working on as well. So start location, I know, yeah, there's very basically nothing on that, but we'll have it as a new location anyway, just so we can edit it later or anything. Cool. Objectives. I'll do these in red. Only one objective for this one, which is there. Again, 1 pixel per layer. Perfectly fine, because it's relevant to the system. And then enemy locations. So in something like Space Hulk, usually no enemies actually on the map to start with, and they all come in through these entrance ports rather than anything else. So when we're doing this, as you can see, I've had to explain certain features to it as I'm mapping it, and that's the kind of stuff that I will need to talk about in annotations or anything else as well. So that is pretty much the very basic layout of this map. So just get that reference back up. Obviously it's turned there, but most of this stuff is there. So I've got my entrance points, I've got my doors down, and I've actually got the map set up, and each one of these squares represents 1 player space or 1 piece space when we're doing analog stuff. But exactly the same for the digital versions. So the original digital version of Space Hulk was pretty much a carbon copy of the board game anyway. So there is pretty much that first mission done in a very limited scale, I'll give you that. But it's that place where we can start. So if you've never touched this stuff before, you should be able to draw squares that are already in place. It's literally just colouring by numbers at this point. But then we can go and enhance this in some way. So if I wanted to make this a bit bigger, I could. Or if I wanted to annotate it, which is probably what I will show you, we can't do certain things, but we can do some other sneaky things. So if I was going to start adding sort of information to this and go out, I need to actually list what these things are, so player starts and whatever. If you try and put some text down, I know, size 60 there, it's a bit silly. Yeah, size 6 font in pixel land is pretty small here, so it's not useful. So this is one of the limitations of the pixel map. But what we can do is you should, if you're on anything modern, have something called the snipping tool installed as standard. If you don't, you should be able to find it, or you can just print screen and do this. So the snipping tool is great, and just go new and then grab the area we want, so something like that. Notice I'm keeping this grid on because it's actually really important to our game. If I just then copy that, hop onto Photoshop to open up a new document at the clipboard size and then paste that in, this is now a massively upscaled version of our pixel stuff. So if I try to draw some more pixels, you can see they're infinitely smaller now than they were before, which if we want to come and edit the map, we can't really edit the map doing this, but once we're finished, we can now add annotation wherever we want. There we go. Or something a bit more useful than that, where we're going through and doing these things. So again, a very straightforward and quick way of building a basic map, which we can then go on to use more things for as well. So from something basic, here's one I did earlier. We've got the basic map coming down here. Again, I haven't annotated it, but that's fine. You can see we've got exactly the same reference, exactly the same thing. So if I gave someone this map instead of the other map, they should be able to work it out. Or I actually have done as well is created an upscaled version. So this is 3 times as big as the other one. In some ways it's better, in some ways it's worse. It's clearer, I can see, so the doors now actually have a obvious way that they're going to open and how you get to them. But I've kind of lost my player scale for it. So what I have done is created a sneaky layer on top where I can highlight each of the actual squares, and if I just turn the helpers off by Control and H, I could do this, and it just looks a little bit better in that respect. But I would definitely be starting with this very smaller pixel map, and then kind of just building up those annotation layers as you go along, rather than trying to do something massive to start with. And once you have got that, as I said, you can easily grab something like this. So if I just I'll just duplicate this map for now. Duplicate that. This, and then if we just drag it over there, what I can do, especially at this scale, is actually just grab the layer or the selection, whatever you want to do. I'm going to transform it, so that's Control and T, and you should be able to see this bounding box around here. And then I can, oops, where is it? There it is. Actually scale it up and down. Now this gets a bit weird when we're doing this, so I'll just escape that. What we'll do, or what I'll show you, is a sneaky way of doing it, which is you grab it, so Control T, you've got this bounding box. Now up at the top you've got width and height, and we are just going to put a 300 instead of a 100, and there we go, 300 width, 300 height. And just make sure when you're doing this, it probably won't be set up on yours, is to use the interpolation mode of nearest neighbor, because if we use something like bilinear, it's not actually going to show me today, it'll start adding ditherage on the edges, and it won't be as crystal clear as it was. When you're using larger images, you may want to change this interpolation sort of thing, but for now, nearest neighbor is what we're after. So once you've done that, hit enter a few times, and I'll have to move our map a bit more. There we go. We now have that same map, but at 3 times the scale, and we can add some more detail onto it, like we did on this one here. and things can be a bit more clear. You can draw arrows in, or you can actually just draw them in anyway. So this is exactly the same method which I used when I was showing you the Facing Worlds map, or the intro to it in one of the other videos. Exactly the same technique, though I have actually measured out the player spaces and how big all the access ports are for it, and things like that. So if you've got different layers, you're going to need to show these, and then you'll bring it into some other thing to annotate it, or that method I just showed you, grab it, copy paste onto a new layer and do so. The other way of doing things is just to get kind of a rough outline. So as you've probably already seen on this one, this is the UAC map from Doom, which I've started on, and it can start getting quite tricky with these things when you've got larger maps, especially when you've got very odd non-linear sort of coverage stuff. So the introductory area of the UAC is very straightforward. It's just some corridors, bits and pieces like that as we're coming along, and I've just highlighted objective points, and there's a ramp going up here, things like that. But as soon as we start getting those more difficult areas, it does get a little bit more tricky to show. So these maps are a bit more abstract, as you can see for the outside area, which I've started covering in the bases, and I've started covering in this endpoint here, and highlighting some other things and pieces. So this kind of thing will take a decent amount of time to actually get it right for it, especially if you're doing a kind of large map, because the UAC is it's an outside difficult map, as are most of the ones in the new Doom. They're pretty long, they're pretty all over the place, but some of the other games, a lot of them have indoor sections or very linear sections, so this pixel mapping technique kind of works quite well for it. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for this, because we've shown you how to kind of set up Photoshop for this pixel map stuff, and just draw the basics in. That's all we need to start with, is just the basics, and then you can start enhancing it and adding a bit more details as you get more confident with Photoshop, or as you need to add some more stuff into it. And this stuff is really easy to change if you're building your own, designing your own level, especially for Unreal Tournament. You can start messing around for it. Obviously doing things that aren't quite straight get a bit more tricky, but it's a good place to start. Right, I'll leave it there for you, so let's hopefully get some good Photoshop maps on the way. Okay.